They told me living with an alien diplomat would be interesting, but no one warned me about the night her skin lit up like a dying star, or how one wrong touch would trigger a ritual older than her planet. I didn't know what her glowing markings meant, or why she whispered that dangerous word bonded, as if my name had rewritten her fate. Now the embassy keeps calling, the walls won't stop humming, and she won't tell me what happens if the ritual completes. All I know is this: she fell asleep on my shoulder, and the universe hasn't been the same since. They told me early on that living with an alien diplomat would mean I'd learn to be flexible. They didn't specify how flexible. My name is Jonah Holly. I'm tall enough for subway crowds and short enough for airplane legroom. I make a living fixing broken HFY units and pretending to understand modern art. My roommate, on the other hand, was a walking diplomatic incident, wrapped in iridescent skin and a suit tailored to make 3 ambassadors look underdressed. Her name was Ambassador Leaseless for short when I wanted to sound casual, and she wanted to stop filing a diplomatic note for each conversation, and she had moved into my 2-bedroom in Queens for reasons that made about as much sense to me as space. Whether she arrived with a suitcase the size of a small moon and a posture that suggested the laws of gravity had signed a treaty with her spine. Lise had luminescent markings that crawled like living constellations under her skin. Pale hair threaded with silver that floated slightly off her scalp, as if offended by Earth's atmosphere. And eyes that shifted through colors I didn't have names for. She had a voice like cool marble, and a laugh that could rearrange furniture. She was an alien diplomat. Yes, one of those rare, headline-friendly, scent of cedar and diplomacy types who could negotiate a trade deal and then politely scold the Prime Minister for interrupting. She also insisted on paying more than half the rent because your planetary currency is imbalanced and you have good taste in cheap coffee, I argued. She raised an eyebrow that glowed aquamarine, and the debate ended with me taking the sofa and her taking the study. Human customs can be charmingly illogical, she said the 3rd week, when we'd both become comfortable enough to share the same kitchen at 3 a.m. without a treaty. For instance, why do you involuntarily keep your mouth open and inhale sharply when someone tilts their head toward your shoulder? It's called breathing, I replied. It appears to be more pleasurable than practical. She said it as if she were transcribing a strange dialect into her notebook. I laughed. She didn't, because diplomats rarely laugh, unless the humor has been pre-cleared in triplicate dot. The thing about Lise was, she was literal in the most literal, devastatingly endearing way. Her cultural handbook, she had one, of course, was dense with customs that read like small laws. On her world, closeness was a formal language. A flick of a wrist could mean friend. A certain lean meant acceptable trading. Partner. And sitting with your back pressed to. Someone could mean we trust each other enough to share metabolic energy. For them, proximity was an honest thing. You exchanged warmth. You matched pulses. No passive-aggressive texts. No awkward posturing. Just simple, biological clarity. She told me that once, during a negotiation, a junior envoy had sat crosswise on the ambassador's lap to demonstrate utmost respect. The room had been momentarily silent. Then she'd laughed until she had to excuse herself. I filed that anecdote away under alien humor. Do not attempt. Which is how I ended up on a Thursday with Lise, perched on the arm of my sofa, boots dangling, her knees almost at my stomach, watching a holla from a streaming service that hadn't yet hit our market. She had a tendency to adopt positions that made a chess master rearrange the board. Closer, she said suddenly, like a directive from a public service announcement. I shifted. To the left? To the right? Do you want popcorn? No, physical adjacency. She moved, not in a shy way, but in the way a comet decides on its orbit. She eased her hip against mine, and then, unaccountably, because Lise did things, unaccountably with the authority of a treaty, she lowered herself and rested her head on my shoulder. She fell asleep on my shoulder. The room's hollow flickered a soft blue. Lisa's skin dimmed from electric opal to something softer, the constellation lines along her clavicle pulsing in slow waves. She exhaled a tiny, perfectly human-sounding breath, and her hair grazed my neck. It should have been sweet and innocent, and honestly, almost boring. But for reasons I would later argue strongly about at great length, it was not. On Lisa's world, falling asleep while in proximity, especially with another being's shoulder as a pillow, was a recognized sign of trust. It was also sometimes, rarely, a precursor to deeper biological phenomena. I would have known this if she'd given me the 728-page Living with Lise pamphlet in advance. She hadn't got it first. I admired her hair. The tips had a faint, bioluminescent sheen like ocean foam under moonlight, and the markings along her neck blinked out slow messages I couldn't interpret. I felt the heat of her body, not overwhelming but intimate, and a low vibration hummed under her skin. A private drumbeat I hadn't noticed before. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't bad, nothing like perfume. It was warm, like rain on hot steel, and it tugged at a place behind my teeth that made my palms sweat. Lisa's breathing shifted from even to slow and deeper, and the constellation lines at the base of her throat brightened in a rhythm that matched a heartbeat I suddenly felt in my own chest. That hum I had been hearing swelled into something like a chord, and the apartment seemed to contract around the two of us. I froze. A stray hot dog, half-eaten in the kitchen, remained frozen in time. The holla kept streaming. My brain chose the worst response available, nervous humor. Lise? I whispered. You're? Calmer than my mattress. Her lips twitched in something that might have been a smile. Your shoulder conforms to my cranial curvature. It is efficient. I tried to relax. I had always prided myself on being a steady guy. I've been through bad breakups, worse landlords, and a particularly traumatic experience with a raccoon and a garbage disposal. I am not easily unmoored. But there was something biochemical and insistent vibrating behind my rib cage. Now, a practical pressure wrapped in syrup. The constellation lines along her jaw flared, and her skin brushed against my collarbone, sending pinprick fireworks of warmth down my arm. Double quotes. Do you need anything? I ventured. The hum answered. Lisa's eyelids tightened. Her hand, that slender, dexterous thing with pads that looked like polished mother-of-pearl, found mine and closed around it, as if seeking the anchor of human flesh. Her fingers were cool, then warming, with a subtler glow that traced our contact like a live circuit. The sphere of light around us brightened. Jonah, she murmured, voice low. There is an adjunctive resonance taking place. Adjunctive, I wanted to Google that word, and then stop myself, because Googling during a potential alien mating event seemed unwise. Is that good? It means, she said, cheeks brushing my neck, and her markings pulsed a flustered magenta and emotional color I did not possess in my human palate. I am responding. Biologically, this may escalate. Escalate. She used it like a weather report. My tongue, traitorously, decided to be funny. Is there like a manual? So you're bonding? A layman's guide? If there is, she whispered, very close to my ear, it is classified by my embassy. I heard the laugh in her voice now, the one that could rearrange furniture. It was embarrassed, too. The constellation lines along her sternum twitched and brightened in a way I'd come to recognize as rising arousal on Lisa's physiology. The smell thickened feminine, but not crude, and I realized with the kind of slow, mortified clarity that comes when you read an entire policy manual too late, She was undergoing a mating reflex. On her planet, certain acts of trust triggered a bonding state that could become a runaway biological process. It wasn't always sexual in the human sense. Often it was merely an exchange of comfort hormones, a shared lullaby of sensed heart rates, a soft physiological dovetailing. But sometimes, especially when the trust gesture involved sleep or intentional closeness, the reflex deepened. It was as natural as a tide and twice as relentless. "Okay," I said, which is a terrible sentence to say when your apartment hosts a potential cross-species ritual. "Okay, so what do we do?" "Contact needs stabilization," she said in that precise voice that could declare a ceasefire. "You must hold me to maintain proximity until the resonance completes or dissipates. It can last depending 90 to 120 Earth minutes." My entire body made a face. 90 to 120 minutes. That was an episode of a sitcom. That was the time it takes to marinate chicken when you're improvising. That was also an eternity if someone's species happens to literally bond by sleeping on your shoulder. You're kidding. She opened an eye, at once incredulous and oddly earnest. I would not misrepresent the temporal window for a biological stabilization. Great. So I sit still? "Hold me." Her hand tightened around mine. "Please." So there I was, Jonah Hall, professional HFY guy, holding an alien diplomat who was asleep on my shoulder and might, scientifically, be inducting me into a lifelong partnership. I hesitated only long enough to reposition, so neither of us had numb limbs, then wrapped an arm around her back. Her skin hummed against my forearm like a voiceless song, and tiny sparks of light crawled along the place where fabric met dermis. The apartment was suddenly very small, and the hollow's glow seemed shameless around us. I tried to focus on the absurd, on the fact that I was, quite possibly, the most compromised homeowner in New York. I told myself jokes. My inner monologue made puns about treaties and binding agreements. Lisa's breath flattened into a pattern that calmed me. Or maybe I was projecting time, did that elastic thing it does when you are acutely aware of someone else's heartbeat. 5 minutes felt like a folding chair. 15 stretched like taffy. By 30, we had fallen into a private rhythm. I adjusted so her head would be more comfortable. She shifted slightly, and the constellation lines on her collarbone answered. Occasionally she murmured phrases in her languid soft syllables that made the light on her skin shimmer, and once she tightened into me like a child claiming safety, which caused an unexpected and deeply humane swell of protectiveness in me. The apartment was quiet in that way that a room becomes when the rest of the world politely declines to interfere. I let my guard go, not completely, but enough to notice things. The way her lashes cast miniature shadows, the faint metallic tang of her breath, the way her neck angled against my clavicle as if it had finally found a curve it liked. I imagined, for a wild second, telling my mother that I'd made a friend. My mother would have retired to the kitchen and called it progressive companionship. And then the doorbell rang. If the universe has a sense of humor, it has perfect timing. The bell sounded like live theater. Lisa's eyes blinked open. The constellation lines along her cheeks flared a coral of surprise. I jerked as if the buzzer had zapped me, which it hadn't, but my muscles betrayed me with all the grace of someone trying to mime, "Not guilty? Jonah?" Lise whispered, the diplomat now awake and instantly alert. Her sleep-smoothing aura did a quick recalibration. The hum dulled and turned into a barely audible purr. "We must not interrupt." "Too late," I said. I eased my arm from around her, not uncaring, mind you, but in the pragmatic sense of, someone is at the door, and we are on display. Lise protested with a rueful noise, and crawled upright, her hair fanning like a flag. The constellation pattern across her throat glowed with a color I would later learn meant embarrassed with protocol. I padded over to the intercom. "Who is it?" I asked. "Harper," said a familiar voice. "Harper, my coworker and friend from the Havoc office." Harper had a laugh like a punchline and a tendency to show up when I least wanted to be seen. "You home? Thought we could grab a beer." Lisa's face did not relax. In the space of 3 heartbeats, she became a creature of focused intensity. The lines on her sclera contracted in a way I'd come to learn meant attention, and the soft hum that had become background music pulled into a taut string. For a heartbeat I thought, absurdly, about the time Harper once tried to convince me that duct tape could fix a broken toaster and failed, leading to a minor electrical stir-fry and a deep philosophical conversation about adhesives. Harper was friendly, unthreatening, and an appliance of chaos. I buzzed Harper in. "Coming up," I said. Harper shrugged into the doorway a minute later, wearing the kind of grin that could have been pre-approved by the government. "Hey, Jonah." "Who's—" She stopped, mid-step, because Lise was standing less than a handshake away and glowing softly like a lounge light about to file taxes. Lise was taller than Harper by a head, the markings across her décolletage now a subtle lunar tide, and she had a presence that made Harper's grin wobble. "Wow," Harper said. Because presidents and poets had both used that word at this moment in history, Lisa's posture shifted like a drawn bowstring. The color at the base of her throat heated into a magnetic amber. Her palm found my forearm and landed there like an anchor. I felt my own pulse register in my fingertips. Funny how nerves can be transferred like that, and Harper, oblivious and chatty, launched into her standard greeting. "Hi, Jonah, new roommate?" Harper's voice slid between us, a conversational skewer. "I'm Harper, from the office." "You okay? You two look cozy." Cozy. The word should have been a kiss-kiss sound effect. Instead, it detonated. Lisa's eyes flashed and then narrowed, not in anger, necessarily, but in an alien sort of possessive calculation that was startling in its clarity. The lines on her wrist brightened into a warning pattern I hadn't seen before. Her fingers tightened around my arm like a clamp. "This human," she said slowly, as if translating something into a language Harper might understand, "is my anchor at present?" Harper blinked. I am stabilizing." Lisa's voice was that precise, diplomatic instrument again. "Physical proximity is required for completion." Harper leaned back, an eyebrow lifted. "Completion of what?" Lisa's gaze flicked to me, then back to Harper, and something like heat rose in her cheeks. Her skin chose a color for jealous that I did not have an exact match for. "You may not linger," she said. "This interaction is private." Harper's head tilted, confusion painting a perfect arch on her face. "Oh, right. Wow. Sorry. Didn't mean to." She waved one hand, which looked ridiculous beside Lisa's contained authority. "I'll go." "Beer later?" she offered, retreating as if the apartment had just been declared an active sovereign zone. As Harper left, Lisa's shoulders slumped with relief, and she let out a breath that sounded like a choir of tiny chimes. The constellation along her throat cooled into a moonlight silver. I exhaled in a single long human sound that expressed equal parts embarrassment and adrenaline. "You didn't have to." "You know," I said, because we both knew what Lisa had done. The possessive flash had been unmistakable. "I did not have to," she said, but there was fondness now in her voice. I reacted. "I do not enjoy being exposed." "It's fine," I said, trying to make my voice casual. My heart felt like I'd run upstairs twice. "And also—" "Wow." She turned to me slowly, like someone revealing a medal. The markings along her clavicle slowly rose into a delicate pattern that made the light tender. "Jonah," she said, and the intimacy in her phrasing was carved carefully from decency and newly formed affection. "You did well. You steady?" The anchor point stabilized me. You called me an anchor, I said. The smugness in my voice was involuntary, and she recognized it because she smiled, really smiled so wide, it made the constellations in her cheeks scatter into stars. An excellent metaphor, she replied. Also, I have filed an immediate notice with my embassy that this occurred. Protocol requires a declaration. A declaration? My stomach did a thing that had nothing to do with gravity. Yes. Lise touched the pad at her throat and produced a sound like a ceremonial chime. Culturally, sleeping on a host's shoulder and entering a stabilization state is often followed, in my society, by a formal ephemeral bond. Ephemeral? It means temporary, she said. A social contract between two sentient beings for a specified period. It carries obligations and privileges. And sometimes, here she paused with the theatrical timing of a historian about to mention footnotes. Sometimes it is worded as bonded for life in archaic translations. My eyes nearly popped. Bonded for life? Like married? For life? I tried to picture myself in a long suit with cufflinks and 3 speeches. I pictured Harper bringing flowers. I pictured a future tax form with spouse, Ambassador Lise, written across the top. Lise's constellation swelled. There was mischief now, delicate as a comet in her expression. Translations are poor. It may also mean, made it until the ritual of non-binding is performed, which is a formal but achievable status change. And you just declared us bonded? I asked, because reality was catching me up in a way I hadn't expected. My life up until 32 had been an accumulation of small, reasonable choices. Take the job, fix the heater, eat suspicious sushi. This felt like being drafted into an interstellar rom-com. I have announced it to my embassy, Lise said, entirely calm. They will interpret contextually. The apartment hummed with the echo of that pronouncement. Outside, a siren wailed, and then moved on. I blinked. You're kidding. I am never kidding about paperwork. Her smile was suddenly tender and ridiculous. But do not worry, Jonah. If it makes you uneasy, we may perform the non-binding ritual together. I understand Earth rituals include, what was the phrase? Breaking up with someone's ceremonies. We can adapt. I didn't know whether to laugh or run. So I did the only reasonable thing. I sat down on the couch, pulled her into my lap as if I had rehearsed it, and kissed her. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a practiced movie kiss with dramatic lighting. It was simple and soft. My lips meeting hers with the awkwardness of a plumber signing a marriage certificate, and the sincerity of a man who had just realized he might never again have a quiet Thursday night. Her skin hummed under my hand in a way that made the hair along my arms stand on ceremony. The constellation patterns across her temple brightened into an exquisite chorus. Ly responded with a quick, surprised laugh that melted into something slower, warmer. Her hands found my face, fingers feather light. The apartment shrank to around our mouths. The holla droned like polite background noise. Whatever ritual biological imperative had been building, whatever chemistry and culture had conspired to make this moment necessary, slid toward resolution. Her breath found a rhythm that matched mine. The chord I'd felt from her earlier became a duet. The hum under her ribcage deepened, then softened into contentment. When we parted. Far too soon and probably under-regulated by interspatial law. Lisa's eyes filled, whether with joy or with diplomatic relief I couldn't tell, and she smiled like someone who had completed a difficult negotiation. That was appropriate, she said. The embassy may consider our status. Sealed provisionally. Sealed, I repeated, testing the sound. It tasted both ridiculous and oddly lovely. Provisionally sealed. She leaned into me, head resting where it had before. Jonah, she whispered. If you accept this, could be an intriguing experiment in cultural exchange. Are you asking me out on a research project? I teased. Do I get funding? You will receive, she said, the right to hold me, pet me, and occasional preferential seating at embassy functions. Preferential seating? I laughed. The absurdity of it all, the humanness of being chosen. The ridiculousness of interstellar paperwork. The delicious warmth of an alien head on my shoulder felt like the best kind of surprise. Also, Lise added, a little mischievous, you will have to sign one thing. One thing? I asked warily. Consent, she said simply. And a schedule. An embassy flyer eventually arrived, because nothing in diplomacy is free of bureaucracy. It was printed in elegant script and translated with loving inaccuracy into English. Notice of temporal bond, initiated by Ambassador Liss. Certified by Intergalactic Relations. Duration, phase 190120 minutes. Subject to renewal. I read it aloud over takeout that night. The two of us laughing until our sides hurt. Harper texted me later so, who's the glow stick? And I sent back a selfie of Lise, who was glowering at the camera with the dignified look of someone who just signed for a package. There would be forms. There would be dinners formal and ridiculous. There would be nights when Lise politely explained why my propensity for sarcasm was a cultural treasure, and nights when she was solemn and precise and taught me the honor of speaking plainly. There would be 1,000 small adjustments. She would learn to enjoy Subway sardines in a humane way. I would learn the difference between bonded for life and bonded for a phase, and find that both were exhilarating. We developed rituals. Sometimes when the city buzzed and stress scrolled like relentless news, Lise would sit on my shoulder and fall asleep like a trusting, luminescent weight. I learned to be still, to let the hum settle, to let our pulses knit like a small, warm fabric. She would nudge me awake with a whisper in her language that translated roughly as "Are you warm?" And I would answer with the truth. Yes, I'm very warm, Dot, and if... Now and then, Harper stopped by and looked at us and raised an eyebrow. Lise would flash a warning glow that made the room warm with possessive light. Harper would back away, and we would both laugh. And I would kiss Lise like a man who had been unexpectedly deputized into devotion that the embassy did. Eventually send an aide to clarify, and another to witness the ceremony of non-binding, which turned out to be two people leaning over paperwork. While I signed things I didn't fully understand, and Lise corrected the translations in a tone that suggested she'd rather be rewriting the Constitution. We ate celebratory cake, shaped like the galaxy, and stayed up until dawn, arguing about the best coffee shop in Queens. People asked for our story later. Because journalists adore anecdotes about humans who do well in interstellar romances. They wanted the headline. Man bonds with alien diplomat after she falls asleep on his shoulder. They wanted to know the exact mechanics. I told them fragments and kept the poetry a low hum under the skin, the way a constellation became a blush private. They wanted gossip. We gave them charm and left the rest. Best of all, there were midnight conversations where Lise would confess things I never expected her to say. Confessions like how she missed a purple moon that smelled like iron, and how she loved the way rain sounded on metal roofs on Earth. I told her about my father teaching me to hold a wrench, my mother sewing buttons that never matched, my neighbor who made the best pickled peaches. We stitched our small histories together into a tent big enough to shelter two. We learned to translate other things too. When Lisa's constellations dimmed, it meant she wanted quiet. When they flared, it meant she was joyous. When they shifted to a turquoise that meant playful, I knew it was time to be ridiculous. It made the world deeply communicative in ways I'd never expected. Years later, if bonded for life ever, implies a later the embassy would congratulate U.S. on completing the Phase 2 formalities, a complicated ceremony involving flowers that sang, and a guest list that included a number of people who had once considered Earth a minor inconvenience. We would stand side by side and laugh at the translation again. Bonded for life, rendered in a bureaucratic pamphlet as though it were a checkbox to be ticked. But on that first evening, when a head rested on my shoulder and an entire culture's customs decided to go viral in my chest, we found something small, sweet, and impressively human. An honest closeness that made the rest of the world feel like background static. Lisa's head in my lap and my hands around her back became a map and a home, both. She woke up sometimes, mid-stabilization, to find me watching her, and she would grin and murmur, "You keep me safe, anchor." I would answer with a ribald joke or a soft kiss, and she would glow a color that meant contentment. And if, occasionally, the embassy chose the phrase, "bonded for life," to describe us in a dispatch that made my heart hop like a startled fish, we would only laugh, because bonded for life sounded dramatic. But what it really meant was simpler and far better. Someone who, in a city of millions, preferred to fall asleep on my shoulder and made my shoulder the best place in the world to nap out the rest of our story bonding ceremonies. Dinners, the hilarious confusion of cross-cultural gift-giving, and the small, fierce protectiveness she'd display when Harper or an over-enthusiastic neighbor made a joke would fill volumes. But it all began with the most unromantic of setups. A sleepy head on my shoulder, a glowing skin, and a hum that told us we were both foolishly, irrevocably hooked. So yes, the ambassador declared us bonded for life. I panicked. I signed things. I gave her preferential seating. And when she fell asleep on my shoulder the next week, I smiled and let myself be her anchor again, because in the hush of the city and under the faint glitter of her constellations, I had learned that life could be both ridiculous and wonderfully right. And as we closed that chapter, with a cliffhanger of embassy memos and Phase 2 looming like an amusing weekend, I kissed her again, not to finish anything, but because I liked how our lips fit, how her constellations sang, and how very human it felt to have a foreign diplomat asleep on my shoulder, dreaming of purple moons and rain on metal roofs.